Hi everyone, let's look at Game 7 of the World Championship. So Jan had the white pieces and Magnus had the black pieces. They played another Ruy Lopez for the fourth time in the match. And they reached this position where Carlsen castled. So this is the fourth time this position has occurred. Carlsen is threatening to play the marshal attack, which would occur after c3 and d5. So Nepo avoided the marshal 3 times in previous games, and he does so here. Now the first time he did this in game 1 he played h3, an anti-marshal move, but then in games 3 and 5 he played a4, which he repeats here, a4. So the reason this is an anti-marshal move is because white hasn't committed the pawn to c3 yet, and that takes a little sting out of the marshal attack gambit. Because white can get maybe some development with putting the knight on c3 if that position does occur. So this is an anti-marshal move. It's attacking the pawn on b5. Notice the pawn on a6 is pinned, so Carlsen has to do something about that. And we saw him try bishop to b7 in one of the games, but the last time this position occurred he played rook to b8, which he does here in this game. Now this move has the disadvantage of giving white the open a file after these pawns get traded, but it does have the advantage of keeping this bishop more flexible. It can go to b7 or it can stay on this diagonal, so it has some options. All right, the pawns do get traded, and now Jan plays h3, which perplexed me. He played this in game 5 as well. I didn't understand that move. It looks like he's trying to keep a piece off of g4. For example, if Carlsen moves this d pawn, then Jan probably doesn't want the bishop to come to g4, pinning his knight. But it seems like he's playing this a move too early. There's no threat yet to put the bishop on g4. Maybe he should wait to move until Carlsen moves the d pawn first, and maybe play something more active like c3 or knight to c3 or something. But I think I understand this move now, maybe a little bit. I think the purpose of this is it's really the same anti-marshal move that he played earlier in the match, h3. The point is, suppose he did play, instead of h3, he played c3. Then maybe black can still play a marshal attack. I don't think it would be called the marshal attack because it's a couple of moves later with the a pawns traded and the rook has been moved over. But he can still play this move d5 now that the pawn is on c3. And this position could occur. The e pawn is gambited. White can take it. And this is typically what happens in the normal marshal. And the same plan of attack by black can occur here. There's an attack on h2. White can block it. Queen h3. And this is all possible because I think 2 factors. One, c3 hampers white's development a little bit. But also h3 is a more useful move against the marshal attack because there never would have been an attack on h2. The queen would have been ineffective on h4. So it's a nice little waiting move. This h3 move is just waiting for black to commit his d pawn. And Carlsen does. He plays it to d6. And now d3 is played. And this is the first new move. In game 5, we got to this position and Jan played c3. And it didn't work out so well for him. He got a small advantage in the opening in that game, but Carlsen was very solid and managed to draw. And his plan was b4. This is what was played in game 5. The idea is he wants to open the b file so that each player has an open file for their rooks. So he doesn't want white to be the only one with an open file. So this time, though, Jan plays d3, doesn't commit his pawn to c3, and we're going to see why. He's leaving that square empty. Black plays h6 here, And the point of that is he wants to play rook e8, but he wants to keep the knight off of g5 because white would be attacking the f7 square if that rook leaves protection. Well, knight c3 is played, and now we see why Jan left his pawn back. He wanted to get his knight out to its natural square rather than the usual, maybe longer, more passive route it takes in the Ruy-Lopez. Rook e8, following up on the plan. Now knight d5, posting the knight in the center, attacking the dark squared bishop. Carlsen has a decision to make. He can try to retain the bishops and retreat it to f8, which is what he did in the game. Another plan he had to consider was what happens if he takes the knight on d5. And I think white actually gets a pretty good game after capturing back with the pawn. This knight has only one square to go to. If it goes to b4, it's going to get trapped. So it has to go to d4. Then white can exchange it off. And structurally, black has a weakness in his position, which is his c-pawn. It's a backward pawn right now. White can play, for example, bishop d2 and maybe get the rook to a7, the bishop to a5, and put some pressure on that pawn. White can also play c3 and try to open the c-file for a rook and pressure that backward c-pawn. The engine assesses this as all zeros, so it's an equal position, but maybe white has a little more play and a little more activity than black does. So Carlsen didn't want to go for that. Instead, he does retreat his bishop, which is a pretty bad bishop behind all those dark squared pawns. But nevertheless, he does retain the bishop pair, and he may get that bishop active later on by pushing g6 and bishop g7, and that bishop is often a pretty good defender of the king side in the Ruy-Lopez. Another benefit of this move is it vacates the e7 square, so this knight can make use of it, maybe come over to the king side and release this c-pawn. And here, Jan played a move that perplexed some of the commentators. He took the knight on f6. I don't think there was any hurry to do that, is what people were saying. He could have played c3 here, for example, maybe gone on with his plan of expanding in the center. This is a counterintuitive move because black's position is cramped. His bishop is bad right here. And when you're cramped and your pieces are on the first rank, you don't want to relieve that by exchanging pieces. White doesn't want to relieve the cramped nature of black's position by exchanging pieces. And exchanging knights here only brings the queen to life. Nevertheless, if you look deeper, I think this is preparation. And I actually believe in this idea. I think it's a good idea that Jan had. There's purpose to taking this knight, as we will see. Okay, so he takes this knight, the queen takes back, and now he plays c3. So he goes back to his old plan from game 5 of playing c3, and he intends to play d4. The difference is Jan has traded his b1 knight for that very active f6 knight. And with that f6 knight missing, there's going to be less pressure on the e4 square, which can be a factor after d4 and black plays e takes d4, opening up the rook on this file. So there will be less pressure on that square. Also, there will be less support for a d5 pawn push. And we're going to see another reason why it's good to bring that knight, to take that knight off of f6 as well. But there's some purpose in the play here. Okay, knight e7 was played, probably heading to g6 and maybe even to f4 at some point. I should point out what happens if Carlsen plays this b4 move now, like he did in game 5, trying to get that open file for the rook. Well, in this case, white can play bishop to a4, attacking the knight, and if black defends it, which he wants to do because it's pinned to the rook, with a move, let's say bishop d7, then that knight is now pinned to the bishop. The knight has nowhere to move to protect the bishop. So white can increase the pressure with d4, threatening d5, attacking the pinned knight, And if black takes on d4, white can recapture with the pawn, still threatening d5. Now, note, there is no knight on f6 in this position to help support the pawn push to d5 to stop white's pawn in its tracks. I think all of this was in Jan's mind when he traded this b1 knight for that f6 knight through this procedure here. I think he was thinking about this b4 move that Carlsen played in game 5, and this position probably was on his radar, and he knew that this knight would not be supporting a d5 push. So black is under pressure here. White has an advantage. So black does not want to push that pawn to b4. And Carlsen did not. He played knight e7, making use of that recently vacated square. Then bishop e3 was played. Some commentators suggested another way of playing, and there are a lot of different ways of playing. If you just play through this game quickly, you play through the moves, it looks a little boring and ordinary and nothing much happens. But there's always so many lines and so many tactics and so many things going on behind the scenes if you take the time to look around for alternative plans. Another plan was suggested here, knight h2, rerouting that knight to a better square. It wasn't doing much on f3. For example, knight g6, the knight can come to g4, attacking the queen. Black probably doesn't want to trade his bishop for that knight. Queen e7 perhaps. Then rook a7, and white's starting to put a little bit of pressure, getting some play, although the advantage is probably minimal, but it's just another way to play. So going back to the game, white tried bishop e3, and then bishop e6 to counteract the strong Spanish bishop here. Now, white plays d4, which was also criticized by some of the commentators as allowing black to relieve his cramped position. People were saying, Caruana and Hess were saying, leave this pawn here for a while. Try to build up your position before you break open the center. Try to improve your pieces. Put pressure elsewhere. Don't be such in a rush to play this move because black is going to liquidate the center. He's going to get some freedom for his pieces. Some trades are going to take place. And I think that's exactly what happens. So d4 is played. Pawns get exchanged here. And Nepo takes back with the c pawn as always intended. I mean, that's the reason you play c3 to support your center, get this strong pawn duo here. But even that move should not be played automatically. Caruana especially was saying maybe you should have taken some more time to consider the alternatives. And Caruana speculated that knight takes d4 may have been a better attempt to get some more pressure and play in the position. If black trades bishops here, then this knight is a little bit of a bother. For example, if black plays knight g6, that knight can sink into that nice square on c6 here. And if black tries to drive the knight away with c5, that's a problem. The pawn on b5 hangs. There's no more pawn on c7 to attack the pinned knight. So the knight can actually live there, and it can be supported by a pawn push to c4. Now if knight g6, releasing the rook to attack the e-pawn, white can protect with f3, for example, knight e5, c4, solidifying the knight on b5, and the commentators I was watching on chess.com were speculating that I don't think they looked this far, and they were saying white has some good play in this position. They didn't analyze it too deeply. But when I put this into the engine, there was a miraculous resource here for black. It does look like white has an edge when you just look at the pieces on the board. You look at that backward pawn, you look at that strong outpost for the knight, you've got the control of the only open file here. But black has an amazing resource to probably draw this position. he can sacrifice the knight here on f3 for a couple of pawns. And now black is threatening a perpetual by moving the queen amongst these three squares. The only way for white to attempt to stop that draw is to put the queen on the second rank to block the checks. But then a rook lift could occur, threatening to come to g6, king to h2 to get out of the way. The rook can now take the pawn on e4, threatening to come over to h4, putting pressure on that square. White can perhaps try to trade queens here and defend that h4 square. But black can actually exchange queens and then take this hanging pawn on c4, threatening the knight with the other rook. The knight has to move back, and now the rook takes on b2. And if you look at this position, black has 4 pawns here for the piece. So I think black has a slight edge. He's pressing for a win. He's in fact threatening both minor pieces at this point, and the only reasonable way for him to save them both is to move the knight to d1 to defend the bishop. But now white's very passive, black's pieces are very active. We've got a couple of passed pawns here, another passed pawn over here, and I think black at least has compensation for the piece. So very interesting stuff going on behind the scenes. All of this stuff is lurking in the position. You've got to think about all this. Chess is extremely complicated, even in these simple looking positions. Anyway, Jan takes back with the pawn as always intended probably. And then black exchanges the bishops and plays his knight to g6. Now that releases the attack on the e4 pawn again. Now, rather than defend it, Jan tries rook e(c1) with the idea of getting a couple of rooks to the 7th rank here. So he's counterattacking a pawn. If he, after rook e(c1), Carlsen plays c5. Now, if he had taken on e4, then Jan would have taken the pawn on c7, of course. Maybe the rook would fall back to protect the 7th rank. But then the other rook can come to the 7th rank. And white has maybe a tiny bit of pressure here, but the engine does assess this as equal. So it was a way to play for black. Black did have that option of trading those pawns. But instead, Carlsen played c5. And then Jan responded with e5. If he had played d takes c5 instead, then d takes c5, bishop takes c5, rook takes e4, and a lot of stuff starts to get traded off. So instead, Jan tried e5, but then Carlsen makes a very accurate response here. He plays queen f5, and that is a threat to push the c pawn forward to c4, bypassing the d pawn there. And in that case, this pawn duo would be pretty powerful. It can create a passed pawn against the b pawn here. Black might be the one pressing for an advantage in that position. So I think that's more accurate than d takes e5, because then white doesn't have to take back on e5. He can take the c5 pawn now that that pawn has left protection of c5. And now the position is unbalanced, and white has a passed pawn here. The engine assesses this as all zeros, but I think if anybody is pressing, it's white. So queen f5 was very accurate, and now white's central pawns are both very weak, and he really needs to trade them off. He can't let this pawn come to c4, so he takes on c5, Carlsen takes back, and now the bishop takes on c5, and the bishops are going to get traded. And then the e5 pawn is going to fall, and the knights are going to get traded, and the rooks are going to get traded. And at this point, there's no play left in the position. Carlsen's liquidation of the center was successful, and the players could agree to a draw right here, but it's only move 26, and the rules forbid draw agreements before move 40. So the players played on. Jan had nothing to play for, so he just offers a queen exchange, which Carlsen takes. They exchange pawns, and there could not be a more drawn endgame than this. Nevertheless, they had to play on, at least until move 40, or a repetition, and they find this repetition, but they play a couple more moves for good measure, and they agree to a draw right here on move 41. So another draw, another successful defense in the Ruy Lopez by Carlsen. I learned a lot from that game, looking a little deeper than I normally do. So there's a lot you can learn from these master games, and these players have to continuously calculate tons of moves every turn of the game, over and over and over again. And there's so much going on behind the scenes that we don't see. Anyway, I hope you learned something from this video. I sure did. Thanks for watching.